We have talked about feminism. We have talked about different aspects of feminist theory. Today I am going to read one particular text which I wrote for one important educational program called ePathshala. This text is available online and you can find on the website of ePathshala three important lessons. One important lesson is on the literary dimension of feminism. This is titled Literary Feminism. The second lesson is titled Marxist Socialist Feminism, and the third lesson is titled Post-Colonialism and Feminism. So today we are going to take up literary feminism. The expression literary feminism has two key words, literature and feminism. The term is used interchangeably with feminist literary criticism. As an academic subject, different from countless activists fighting discrimination and bias in the real world, feminism is an interdisciplinary field which cuts across subject boundaries. Students of history, psychology, sociology, law, among others, study feminism. However, feminism has an extremely important relationship to literary studies. Since its beginning, the literary dimension of feminism has played a very important role in shaping the nature of the subject, hence the currency of the expression literary feminism. Literary studies has not been a stable field. How literature is defined and studied and what constitutes the subject matter of literature are questions which have been answered differently in different times. The advent of theory since the 60s has changed the way readers approach works of literature. Literature was earlier viewed as a universal and timeless artifact. For example, it was generally held that the message in the works of literature, particularly in the works of great writers like Shakespeare and Milton, was addressed to all people in all times to come. Theory posed some difficult questions. It focused attention on the implications of race, class, and gender in literary studies. The first difficult questions were asked by feminist critics. They charged literature for its sexist bias. They questioned the relevance of the canon. They raised the questions of the exclusion of women writers in the established canon of literature, putting gender issues at the very center of their reading and writing. They offered to read literature in a different manner. In other words, a theoretically alert literary feminism was born. Though it is not an ongoing project, though it is an ongoing project, some important works published in the 60s and the 70s have had a seminal influence on literary feminism. Two dominant aspects of literary feminism are generally emphasized by these works. And what are these two dominant strands? What are these two dominant aspects in feminism? One important aspect is to see the role of women as readers. And the second important aspect is to see the role of women as writers. That means women as readers and women as writers. We discuss first women as readers. A growing number of women readers took up the task of reading literary works written by male writers. They focus attention on many problematic aspects of text to which male critics were supposedly blind. Thus, to quote a famous example cited by Jonathan Keller, the sale of his wife Susan and his baby daughter by Michael Henchard in Hardy's The Mayor of Casterbridge is likely to affect a woman reader differently. Susan being represented as a hag, a property, a thing, a commodity to be disposed of so that Michael Henchard can resume his normal life appears very pathological indeed. However, this did not appear so problematic to all male critics. Elaine Showalter is an important American feminist critic. Elaine Showalter quotes the example of Irving Hope, a male critic, praising this scene in the novel. So you see that how one important male critic was completely blind to the issue involved in the sale of wife in an important novel by Thomas Hardy. And Elaine Showalter quotes this critic, Irving Hope, to suggest some problems in the criticism which talked about women. These are Irving Hope's words. To shake loose from one's wife, to discard that drooping rag of a woman and her mute complaints and maddening passivity, to escape not by a slinking abandonment but through the public sale of her body to a stranger as horses are sold at a fair, and thus to rest through sheer immoral willingness a second chance out of life. It is with this stroke, so insidiously attractive to male fantasy, that the Mayor of Casterbridge begins, quoted in Morris. This image of a suffering wife and a woman can fill a woman's heart with horror. A number of critics have quoted this passage in their works to show the insensitivity of a particular kind of criticism. This kind of criticism was considered phallic criticism by Mary Ellman. Mary Ellman is an important feminist writer. Gradually, a number of works appeared which looked at these negative images of women in works of male writers. In fact, a whole industry of images of women study flourished in the academy. What is this particular study called? Images of women study. Two pioneering studies which influence images of women study include Mary Ellman's Thinking About Women and Kate Millet's Sexual Politics. These are two important works, Thinking About Women and Sexual Politics. Myth and archetypal criticism had already talked about some stock images which have appeared in literature. Images like the temptress, the mother, the wise old man were already discussed in archetypal criticism. Many works also discuss the hero archetype in works of literature. There is some link between archetypal criticism and the feminine stereotype highlighted by Mary Ellman. She discovered that men have traditionally identified women with some stereotypes. The feminine stereotype she highlighted included, among others, formlessness, passivity, instability, materiality, spirituality, piety, and irrationality. These are all feminine stereotypes. Thus, the stereotype of irrationality means that unlike men who are thought to be rational creatures, women are dubbed as irrational. How often in our day to day life do we hear that women are guided by their heart and men by their mind? Elven also spoke against what she called sexual analogy, whereby the emotional and intellectual nature of man, whereby the emotional and intellectual nature of women is considered equal to their sexual nature. In a very witty manner, she discussed the treatment given to women's writing in phallic criticism. There must always be two literature like two public toilets, one for men and one for women. These are her words, Mary Ellman's words. In another interesting formulation, she said that books by women are treated like women by male critics. That means books by women are treated like women. Ellman's work is important for literary feminism because she has given examples mostly from literature. And here it is important to note that feminist writings, they cut across different subject boundaries and they can appear in different subjects. So Ellman is important because she is giving examples from literature, and that's why we are discussing her in our class on literary feminism. And the other critic, Kate Millett. Kate Millet's sexual politics was even more influential. She dared to attack canonical male writers like D.H. Lawrence, Henry Miller, Norman Mailer, and Jean Genet for perpetuating some misogynistic images of women. She revealed that Lawrence celebrates a cult of virility in his fiction. Miller displays women hatred in his works, and Mailer shows his anxiety and fear of losing power to women. The common feature in their work was the division of strictly masculine and feminine personality, right? Like Elman, Millett highlights the fact that men are identified with leadership and ambition, whereas women with domesticity, childbearing, and dependence on men. Concepts like aggression, intelligence, force, and efficiency are associated with men, and passivity, ignorance, docility, and ineffectuality with women. This kind of binary division, where men are associated with some positive qualities and women with negative, appears in the work of many other feminist critics. In fact, it is a dominant idea in feminist discourse. In her highly celebrated book, The Second Sex, this is an important book. Was it was published in 1949. In her highly celebrated book, The Second Sex, which is now considered a feminist classic, French thinker Simone de Beauvoir, drawing upon Hegel's distinction between the self and the other, discuss how women have always been defined as the other of man. In her exposition of this distinction, self is male, whereas its other is female. The other is associated with all negative traits, which the self discards. Thus, if the self considers itself rational, the other is given the identity of irrational. All other binary divisions, such as strong and weak, active and passive, aggression and docility, can be explained on this basis. Shoshana Fellman's words can be quoted here. Shoshana Fellman, an important critic, and I quote her words. Theoretically subordinated to the concept of masculinity, the woman is viewed by man as his opposite, that is to say, as his other, the negative of the positive, and not in her own right, different, otherness itself. It has been quoted by Ruthven. The arbitrary division of male and female characteristics creates problems for reading the text, especially written by men. Should women readers identify with a male point of view aggressively present in text, like those of D.H. Lawrence and Norman Mailer? Should they not try to read differently? Why should they be forced to take pleasure in the sale of a wife and a baby daughter, which fills them with dread? Should they identify with such text? Why should they be forced to read like a man? Why should they read like a man? Why should they not read like women? These questions have been raised by most feminist critics. The title of Judith Fetterly's work, The Resisting Reader, which was published in 1978, it answers some of these questions. Influenced by Kate Millet's sexual politics, Judith Fetterly's book is also a feminist intervention in reader response criticism. In the preface of the book, she outlined her intention to take up the kind of work that she took, obliquely referring to Karl Marx's emphasis on social change. She exhorted the feminist readers to change the existing practices of reading. She considered feminist criticism a political act, the aim of which is not simply to interpret the world, but to change it by changing the consciousness of those who read. You know that Karl Marx had said, philosophers have interpreted the world. The need is to change it. And so here, Judith Fetterly reworks this sentence. And when she says, Her job is not simply to interpret the world, but to change it by changing the consciousness of those who read. And Fraternity attempts to change the consciousness of the reader by refusing to accept what is there in the work. The existing practice of accepting everything on trust must go. He exhorts the feminist critic to, and I quote her words, she exhorts the feminist critic to become a resisting reader rather than an assenting reader. And by this refusal to assent or accept, to begin the process of exorcising the male mind that has been implanted in women readers. That means when women have been forced to read like men, he wants this practice to be discontinued. The intent of Fetterly was nothing short of revolutionary, as she announced her work to be, and I quote her words, her work was for her a self defense survival manual for the woman reader lost in the masculine wilderness of the American novel. That means woman reader was lost in the masculine wilderness and she is trying to liberate this woman reader. Fetterly discovered that American writers have presented American experience from a purely male point of view. The idea of a life in an all male world free from the chains of domesticity, the concept of male bonding, the restricting influence of women on men are all taken up in American stories and novels. He studied many celebrated stories such as Rip Van Winkle, I Want to Know Why, The Birthmark, and A Rose for Emily, and novels like A Farewell to Arms, The Great Gatsby, and Bostonians to see the celebration of a male point of view. In all, Fetterly's was an important work to reveal male bias in American literature. So, which are the famous stories which Fetterly studied? Rip Van Winkle, I Want to Know Why, The Birthmark, this is a story by Hawthorne, and A Rose for Emily, and of course, those novels which I mentioned. The second important aspect was women as writers. So far we were discussing women as readers. Now we discuss women as writers. Elaine Showalter identified two important aspects of feminist criticism. One is feminist critique and the other is gynocritics. Feminist critique and gynocritics. A concern with works written by male writers and a critique of the representation of women in their works. In other words, women as readers defines the first aspect. Mary Ellman's critique of phallic criticism, Kate Millet's attack on canonical male writers, and Judith Fetterly's advocacy for the resisting reader are obviously part of feminist critique. Gynocritics, on the contrary, is a more positive project and it is concerned with what it is concerned with. I quote, women as the producer of textual meaning. Women as the producer of textual meaning. In her famous essay, Feminist Criticism in Wilderness, Walter explained that gynocritics is concerned with, and I quote, women as writers, the history, style, themes, genres, and structures of writing by women, the psychodynamics of female creativity, the trajectory of the individual or collective female career, and the evolution and laws of a female literary tradition. Unquote. So these are important things. These are important aspects of women's writing. What are these important aspects? And here we are trying to define gynocritics. Women as writers, the history, style, theme, genres, and structures of writing by women, the psychodynamics of female creativity, the career of women, and to discover whether there has been any literary tradition of women's writing or not. That means everything relating to women, whether it is their creativity, whether it is the history of their writing, whether a particular kind of style that can be identified in their works, whether any special feature of that style. These are all important aspects. These are all part of Gynocritics, which was an important project taken up by many feminist critics who believed that they should not be wasting all their time on just critiquing work of male writers. Rather, they should also pay attention to what is positive about women's writing. That means not simply critique of works by male writers, but also discovering traditions of women's writing. A concern with gynocritics can be seen not only in Showalter's work, but also in the work of a number of women critics. Who are they? In her work Literary Women, Elaine Moers concentrates on women writers, especially their interaction with each other and the literary relationship formed by them. By talking about a number of canonic women writers' communication with each other, Moers emphasizes the presence of a literary tradition. He discusses how there was a literary interaction between George Eliot and Harriet Beecher Stowe, and between Emily Dickinson and Elizabeth Browning. Moyers also highlight the distinctive and unique in the work of each writer. We can talk about this kind of relationship existing between many Urdu writers also, Urdu women writers also, whether there was this relationship between Kurtula and Heather and Ismat Chuktai, or for that matter, was there any relationship between Wahida Tabassum and other female writers? So that means these are questions which can be taken up to discuss tradition, traditions of women's writing in other literatures as well. The discovery of kinship between women writers, it is often not realized, had very deep implications, as Paul Morris says. And these are Paul Morris's words. Finding their own emotions, circumstances, frustrations, and desires shared, named, and shaped into literary form, gave and continues to give many women, some for the first time, a sense that their own existence was meaningful, that their view of things was valid and intelligent, and their suffering was imposed and unnecessary, and a belief in women's collective strength to resist and remake their own lives. Writing by women can tell the story of the aspects of women's life that have been erased, ignored, demeaned, mystified, and even idealized in the majority of traditional texts. So, what we see, that means this kinship was important, and how it was important for these women writers to see that their own frustration or their own desires were very much part of the desires and circumstances and emotions of other women writers. Elaine Showalter also discussed a female literary tradition in English literature in her famous book, A Literature of Their Own. She considers women's literature in terms of a female subculture, that is her phrase, a female subculture, which has its own themes, patterns, and motives. She also viewed literary periods from the perspective of women's writing and divided them into three different phases. Namely, what are three different phases that Elaine Showalter discusses? Feminine, feminist, and female. Feminine, feminist, and female. In the first phase, there is a prolonged phase of imitation of the prevailing modes of the dominant tradition and internalization of its standard of art and its views on social roles. That means in the first phase, they are all trying to just internalize dominant tradition. In the second phase, there is a phase of protest against these standards and values and advocacy of minority rights and values, including a demand for autonomy. Finally, there is a phase of self discovery, a turning inward from some of the dependency of opposition, a search for identity. However, critics of Showalter point to the racial bias in her scheme. As Suzy Tharu and K. Lalita write, they are important Indian critics. What they write? Although the period covered by Showalter's book coincides with the age of high imperialism, neither Britain's colonial possessions nor the complicity of English women English women writers in the ideologies of class and of empire are seriously dealt with. So Suji Tharu and Lalita raise different questions about feminist criticism, and they raise these questions from the perspective of post-colonialism. In a work of a different nature, Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gruber also try to highlight a female literary tradition and female literary creativity as women writers' response to male literary assertion and coercion. In the face of male literary traditions, women writers experience a sense of anxiety and confinement. Focusing on the work of women writers like Jane Austen, Mary Shelley, the Bronte sisters, George Eliot, and Emily Dickinson, Gilbert and Gruber discover a hidden note of rage, revolt, and concealment in women's writing. So, what do Gilbert and Gruber discover in women's writing? Element of rage, a note of revolt, and a sense of concealment. They pay attention to Bertha Mason in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre and consider her a typical example of this rage and concealment. Bertha Mason, you remember, is an important character in Jane Eyre. So, what do Gilbert and Gruber write? As we explore 19th century literature, we will find that this mad woman emerged over and over again from the mirrors women writers hold up both to their own natures and to their own visions of nature. Even the most apparently conservative and decorous women writers obsessively create fiercely independent characters who seek to destroy all patriarchal structures which both their authors and their authors' submissive heroines seem to accept as inevitable. Of course, by projecting the rebellious impulses not only into their heroines but into mad or monstrous women who are suitably punished in the course of the novel or poem, female authors dramatize their own self division, their desire both to accept the structures of patriarchal society and to reject them. These are the words of Gilbert and Gruber. One very important line of inquiry in gynocritics is the discovery of lost women writers. Lost women writers. The assumption implicit in the concept of lost writers is that many women must have written in the past without getting any recognition for their effort. It also implies that many women would not have been able to get their writings published as the time may not have been suitable for them to publish. The discovery of lost writers was taken up with a sense of urgency by a number of feminist critics. Joe Walter's work was responsible for the rediscovery of Mary A. Mary E. Braden, Rhoda Broughton, Sarah Grant, and George Egerton. This means these are writers who were not discussed earlier. These were lost writers. Critic Nina Beam conducted her research for a tradition of women's writing and for lost women writers, especially novelists, in her study of women novelists in America from 1820 to 1870. The idea of a female tradition of writing also informed the monumental study titled Women Writing in India 600 BC to the present by Suzy Thoru and Lalita. They are the editors of this work. Their work is even more important as they have highlighted the work of a number of women writers who wrote in different Indian languages right from the ancient period to the present. However, unlike Nina Bain, Walter or Elaine Morse, Tharu and Lalita focus on writing cutting across genres and not necessarily literature, which though is not excluded in their magnum opus. But such has been the influence of Tharu and Lalita that no anthology of Indian women's writing can be attempted without acknowledging a debt to their effort. A recent anthology of women's writing titled Unbound 2000 Years of Indian women's writing, edited by Annie Zaidi, makes its selection on the basis of literary craft, and I quote her words, literary craft, genre bending abilities. The book, as Zaidi says, focuses on writers who have a significant body of literary work and not just one memoir, for instance. This rule would apply to at least 20th century writers. There are exceptions from times when reading and writing were discouraged, if not forbidden, for women. An important issue in gynocritics is the nature of female creativity. This question has been hotly debated both in a theoretical as well as an empirical manner. Do women write differently from men? Do they use language differently? Are there some words which women tend to use more often? Is there really a style of writing which is essentially feminine or masculine? Is the literary imagination androgynous, partaking of both male and female characteristics? The answer to these questions has not been conclusive. Essentially, there are two different approaches adopted to answer these questions. The Anglo American tradition uses the empirical method of analyzing the words used by men and women and tries to make some conclusions. For many of these women, for many of these critics, women's writing is marked by a kind of fluency. They notice an element of fluency in women's writing. Others believe that women's writing should not be punctuated. Interesting thing, that should not be punctuated. Still others believe that women tend to relate to their subject and hence objectivity in writing is a male ideal. Objectivity male ideal because women relate to their subject. However, these issues are far from settled. These are just opinions. A lot of research has gone into discovering what is called WL, and here WL is an aspect of writing, right? The issue of WL has been approached from the perspective of psychological and somatic theories. These are two important theories. Psychological theories see the source of WL in the unconscious, while somatic theories locate WL in the female body. Thus, using Lacan's psychoanalytical theory, French critic Julia Kristeva looks at the source of WL in a child's babble when language has not intervened. Interestingly, according to her account, WL can be detected even in the works of some avant-garde male writers like Joyce and Mallarmé. Somatic theory is mainly represented by the ideas of French critics, especially Hélène Sixot and Luce Irigaray. And what they see? They see morphological differences between the sexual organs as the source of such masculine characteristics, as the preoccupation with correct meanings and unified subject and feminine characteristic like process, plurality, and diversity. I read this sentence again. Somatic theory is mainly represented by the ideas of French critics Hélène Sixto and Luce Irigaray see morphological differences, these are her words, morphological differences between the sexual organs as the source of such masculine characteristics as the preoccupation with correct meanings and a unified subject, and a feminine characteristics like process, plurality, and diversity. In recent years, these are words quoted in the book by Ruthven. In recent years, the scope of literary feminism has grown further. The development and refinement of theories outside the Western world, a growing awareness about women issues, the the rapidly rising number of academics engaged in the study of feminism and the establishment of feminist process have all influenced the course of literary feminism. So this is our discussion of literary feminism. I hope you understood this. Its text is also available online. So you can also read this text and you can also follow this lecture, right? I'll post this lecture. If there are any questions, you can ask those questions if there are any.